Does keeping up with your podcast content feel hard? And does it feel like it is always a struggle to keep up with your podcast? Well, if so, this episode is for you because we are going to talk about why your podcast feels so hard and what you're going to do about it. So stay tuned.
What's up? I'm Angie, and you are listening to Podcast That Pays, the podcast for online business owners who want to grow their business and sell their offers using podcasting. If you like no fluff, tell it like it is advice from a marketing-loving podcast agency owner, you are in the right place. So glad you're here. Let's dive in.
So, welcome back to another episode. And in this episode, we're going to talk about why it feels so hard to continue on with your podcast and what are some things that you can actually do about it so that you can be more consistent and show up for your podcast. So, first, I want to say that I have a friend slash client slash biz bestie who I know who is literally going on her third podcast. She's the most consistent person that I have ever met in my life. And she produces, records, edits, whatever, everything herself. And she is literally moving on to podcast number 3. And I don't mean consecutively, I mean simultaneously. I mean, she's creating her podcast and she will have she has 3 podcasts that she's going to be running at the same time. And I share this because me and her were talking about it and I was just laughing. I was like, oh my God, really? 3 podcasts? And there are people out there in my audience and some of my clients who find it very hard to just stay consistent with one. What is your secret for how to stay consistent and stay on top of 3 podcasts? And so what she said was, in short, is that it is just something that she decided to do. She doesn't understand how you can say that you want a podcast, but then you don't show up and record it. And I was like, you would be surprised at the amount of people who actually do that, and myself included. I can understand how it feels to fall off. I have fallen off. I have had my moments where I was not consistent. I've had my moments where I felt like I didn't know what to talk about. I have experienced all of that. So here is why I think that you find this hard. And there's a couple of reasons, and I'm going to share with you what I feel like that reason is and what we're going to do, what we're going to start to do now to sort of overcome it. So what my theory is that people find this hard because it's not a priority because we're not getting instant feedback and dopamine hits from the podcast. Meaning you can go on Facebook and it feels like you're doing something because we're writing a post and people are responding and liking it, or people are clicking on the link immediately and taking action. And with a podcast, it's not necessarily that. You don't get that instant validation. And so it can be very difficult to continue going almost. It's like in silence, people are liking it. And you don't get that instant gratification. And so you're not really sure how it's working in your business. So you're not seeing that ROI that you want to see, or you're not getting that instant gratification. And then you're not seeing the ROI from your podcast. And the reason for that is that you don't have your podcast set up in the right way in order to show you that ROI. So you don't have your podcast set up in a way where you can actually see where your leads are coming from. You don't know who is taking action from your podcast. You don't know if people are buying from your podcast because you don't know how to see that visibility, right? Because you haven't set it up. You just put the content out there and it's like a hope and a prayer that someone listens. And then all you're looking at is, okay, I have my downloads. And the other piece of this is that, and the reason why it's hard to keep up with is because you don't have it included in your marketing plan. This is not a part of your marketing plan. When you decide to put this as a part of your marketing plan, you won't forget to do it and it won't feel heavy because it is a part of what you do in your marketing. So, for instance, this very episode is a part of my marketing plan. So, I'm going to be taking this episode and I'm recording it now, but whenever it's released at a specific time for a specific reason. And I'm going to do specific things with it. Like, it goes into what I'm doing. There's no not recording this episode because this is the beginning of everything else that I'm doing. Because this episode will then turn into the reels. This episode is going to turn into the TikTok. This episode is going to turn into my Facebook post. And that's what we're going to be talking about that week. So this is the catalyst, or this is the beginning of everything that's going to happen in my marketing for the week. So there's no not doing it. It's not an additional thing to what I'm currently doing. It is the thing that I'm doing. It is the marketing. And that's where I think a lot of people get caught up at, is just having this podcast that's over here that is not a part of anything that you're doing. So of course it feels heavy. Of course it feels hard to keep up with because it's not incorporated into your current marketing system. So if it feels hard for you to come to your podcast, to keep up, to keep coming and showing up and talking about things, I want you to consider really looking at your marketing strategy and what you're doing and how you can incorporate this more into what you currently do. Hey, if you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, I really need to up my podcasting game, or you want to start utilizing your show more for your business to get more leads and sell more offers, then I want you to come over to podcastthatpays.com and check out the Podcast Collab Lab. That's podcastthatpays.com and check out what we're doing over there. I would love you to join us. Okay, back to the show. I also want you to figure out how you are going to use this strategically and how you're going to track what is happening. So I track things in a very archaic way because I am not very tech savvy. And so I will share with you how I track things and how I can know that if this episode, when this episode is released, I can see, are people taking action from this episode? Are people taking action this week? When this episode is released, do I have a spike in people clicking on my link in my commercial? Are people actually converting? How many people listened to my podcast this week versus how many people actually went over and clicked that link or went to podcastthatpays.com? I can see that. And so with each week, I can see how many people actually listen to my commercial, which is go to podcastthatpays.com. And then I can actually see how many people went through and actually purchased my membership from that link. Or I can see the amount of people who actually took action and even clicked to look at that, right? So for me, being able to have that kind of visibility lets me know, hey, this is actually serving a purpose. Also, I'll take this episode and turn it into a reel and say, hey, does your podcasting feel hard for you? Comment podcast below and I'll shoot you over the link to an episode that I did to give you the unlock the secrets to make it not feel hard for you anymore, right? So it's serving a purpose, two parts. It's serving as a piece of content, but it's also getting me leads and bringing me leads into my business because now that person has raised their hand and they're in my DMs because I'll use a mini chat automation, but they're in my DMs. And so now I have this person that is a lead, so I can see that that actually came from this podcast episode. So those are just ways that you can start to implement and see what is happening. Also, when it comes to your content, when you're thinking about what am I creating every single day, the more strategic that you get. So if I know, I don't know, I can plan out my podcast content, for the next month or so, right? So let's say I'll plan my content out for next month. So each week, whatever the topic is, so if we were talking about this, your podcast feels hard, I can be creating that week content in my social media that is all about why my podcast feels hard. So I'm starting conversations about it. I'm telling you, okay, it's feeling hard because you're not getting ROI. So I can talk to you. I can tell you a story about how you get ROI, how one of my clients went from not getting ROI to now getting ROI. Lots of different angles I can take where I can pull content and from this topic. So now I'm looking at my content calendar a little bit differently because it's incorporated with what I'm doing with my podcast. So again, it's not a heavy thing that I'm doing on the side. It's a part of what I'm doing and it's a part of my marketing. And it doesn't feel like you can't do it. It feels like you have to do it because that is where your marketing, that is where your content marketing begins. So it feels like you have to do it. And it doesn't feel hard. It just feels like this is a part of what I do. And I know that's a big thing that trips a lot of people up when it comes to their podcast. So if it has been feeling hard for you, I am willing to bet that it's because you are not seeing ROI or you don't know how to measure for ROI and that you are not incorporating this into what you are currently doing. And if you change those things, if you set your podcast up where you can start seeing some ROI and you also set your podcast up where it is a part of your marketing and becomes the anchor, like this is where my content marketing begins at my podcast, then it will never feel heavy. And the added bonus is that it will also make your content creation feel easier on the other side of this, because now you have this one core idea, this one theme, this one thing that we're talking about, this macro content, and you can go and break it down into micro content, get you some leads, use that content effectively, share it on social media, let it do some work for you. And I promise you, it will feel so much easier and you will feel like you're getting so much more out of your podcast, not just leads, but also because it's a part of your content strategy, it should be making things easier for you to create content. And so it will make you feel better about creating your podcast. Okay. So I hope that helped, and I will see you over in the next episode.
Hey, if you enjoyed the show, head over to podcastthatpays.com to get started on your way to creating a podcast that pays. And don't forget to follow this show and take a screenshot that you were listening and tag me on Instagram at Angie M. Jordan. I'd love to meet you and show you some love over there. Thank you so much for being here. I love you. Let's get this money.